thought of my apartment as my sanctuary. It was a small, cozy place with warm lighting and soft, comfortable furniture that felt like a hug after a long day. It was my escape from the chaos of the world, a place where I could relax and be myself. But lately, something had changed. The very walls that used to offer me comfort now seemed to close in on me, casting long shadows that made my skin prickle with unease. It started with small things so insignificant that I almost didn't notice them at first. One evening, I came home from work and found my living room window slightly ajar. I never opened that window, not since last summer when a swarm of bugs decided to invade my space. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had a lapse in memory. But then it happened again and again. Each time, I would convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had been careless and left it open. Maybe the wind had somehow nudged it ajar. I tried to rationalize, but deep down, a nagging feeling of dread began to grow. It was like a tiny seed planted in the back of my mind, slowly sprouting and taking root. A few days later, I noticed other strange things. My keys were not where I usually left them. I always put them in the little dish by the door, yet twice now, I found them on the kitchen counter. And then there was the picture frame. It was a photo of me and my best friend, Megan, from our trip to the beach last summer. I loved that picture. It captured a moment of pure joy and laughter. One morning, I found it face down on the coffee table, the glass cracked. That was when I started to feel genuinely scared. I could no longer dismiss these incidents as mere coincidences. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had touched my things, moved them around, left their mark in subtle, invasive ways. The thought made my skin crawl, and I began to look over my shoulder constantly, even in my own home. I told Megan about it over coffee one morning. We met at our favorite cafe, a quaint little place with mismatched furniture and the best lattes in town. Megan was always the rational one, the voice of reason in my life. She listened intently, her brow furrowing as I recounted the strange occurrences. "Sarah, are you sure you're not just misplacing things?" she asked gently, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm sure," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "I know it sounds crazy, but I can feel it. Someone's been in my apartment, Megan." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Maybe you should get some new locks, just to be safe. And if it keeps happening, you should go to the police." I nodded, feeling a bit reassured by her practical advice. "Yeah, maybe you're right. I'll look into it." The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I changed the locks, installed a chain on the door, and even bought a little security camera to put by the entrance. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. One evening, as I was settling down with a book, I heard a soft tapping at the window. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, straining to hear. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I slowly got up and approached the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain and peered outside. There was nothing there. Just the empty street, dimly lit by the streetlights. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I turned away, I saw it. A small, white piece of paper, neatly folded and tucked under the window pane. My hands shook as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "I see you." I stumbled back, the note fluttering to the floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who could have left it there? How did they know where I lived? Panic surged through me, and I rushed to lock the window, double-checking all the locks on the doors. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every sound magnified in the silence. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if at any moment, someone could reach out from the darkness and grab me. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but the fear had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. My mind kept drifting back to the note, the way the words seemed to sear into my brain. I see you. It was a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. Someone was watching me, someone who knew where I lived, who had been inside my apartment. The thought was suffocating. I decided to call the police. I explained everything to the officer on the phone, every strange occurrence, the note, the feeling of being watched. They agreed to send someone over to take a look, but their tone was skeptical, as if they thought I was overreacting. When the officer arrived, he did a cursory inspection of the apartment, asked a few questions, and left with a vague promise to keep an eye out. That night, I tried to distract myself with a movie. I chose a light-hearted comedy, something to lift my spirits. But halfway through, I heard it again. The soft tapping at the window. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I forced myself to get up, to face whatever was out there. I pulled back the curtain, and once again, found nothing. But this time, the note was different. It was larger, and the handwriting was bold and angry. It read, "Why don't you believe me?" I dropped the note, my hands trembling violently. I backed away from the window, feeling a rising sense of panic. Whoever this was, they were not just watching. They were taunting me, trying to get inside my head. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, the fear and frustration overwhelming me. I picked up my phone and called Megan, my voice barely above a whisper. "Megan, it's happening again. There's another note." "Sarah, calm down," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "I'm coming over. Just stay inside and lock all the doors and windows. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and hung up. I locked everything again, checking and rechecking each lock, each window. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest, waiting for Megan to arrive. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slow, each one stretching out like an eternity. Finally, I heard a knock at the door, and Megan's voice calling out. I rushed to open it, and she enveloped me in a tight hug. "It's okay, I'm here now," she murmured, stroking my hair. But even as I clung to her, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. And I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. Megan stayed with me that night, and for the first time in days, I managed to get a few hours of sleep. But when I woke up in the morning, I found another note, this time slipped under the front door. It was a single word, written in bold, red ink, "Soon." After the last note, I knew I had to take drastic measures. Megan and I spent the entire day discussing what to do next. She suggested I stay with her for a few days, but I felt a stubborn need to reclaim my space. My apartment was supposed to be my safe haven, and I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning it. Megan helped me install additional locks and even a few more security cameras. We put one by the front door, another in the living room, and one pointing out the window where the notes had appeared. It felt like overkill, but the fear gnawing at my insides wouldn't let me rest until I did everything possible to protect myself. Despite all the precautions, the sense of being watched never left me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. I kept the lights on at all hours, afraid of what might lurk in the shadows. My nerves were frayed, and my mind was a tangled mess of anxiety and exhaustion. That evening, Megan reluctantly left, promising to call and check on me frequently. As soon as she was gone, the silence settled over the apartment like a thick, suffocating blanket. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred together, my mind unable to focus. I turned on the TV, hoping the noise would chase away the eerie quiet, but it only served as a flimsy barrier against my growing dread. Hours passed, and the night grew darker. I found myself pacing the apartment, double-checking the locks and peering out the windows. Everything seemed normal, but the normalcy felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. My phone buzzed with a text from Megan, asking how I was holding up. I replied with a shaky, "I'm okay," even though I was far from it. Just as I was about to sit down, my phone rang. The sudden noise made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the screen and saw unknown caller. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Finally, I steeled myself and answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard it, heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. My blood turned to ice, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" I demanded, but the only response was more breathing, each breath like a sinister whisper in my ear. "Stop calling me," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. I hung up and immediately blocked the number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. But the damage was done. My sense of security had been shattered once again. I sank onto the couch, wrapping my arms around myself in a feeble attempt to feel some semblance of safety. My mind raced with questions and fears. Who was doing this? Why were they targeting me? What did they want? The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. I kept the phone by my side, jumping at every notification. I felt like a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at any moment. Around midnight, I decided to check the security camera footage. I pulled it up on my laptop, scanning through hours of uneventful footage. Just as I was about to give up, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing outside my window. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure move closer, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. It stood there for a few minutes, staring into my apartment, before slipping away into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I replayed the footage, hoping I had imagined it. But there it was, clear as day. Someone had been watching me, just as I had feared. I felt violated, like my privacy had been stripped away. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away and never look back. But I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I called the police again, my voice trembling as I explained what I had seen. They promised to send someone over, but their tone was skeptical, as if they still didn't believe me. I felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. How could they not see the danger I was in? How could they be so dismissive? The minutes stretched on, each one filled with agonizing anticipation. I kept my eyes glued to the laptop screen, watching the footage over and over, trying to catch any other clues. When the doorbell finally rang, I jumped up, my heart racing. I opened the door to find a police officer standing there, his expression bored and indifferent. I showed him the footage, pointing out the shadowy figure. He nodded, taking notes, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He did a quick sweep of the apartment, checking the locks and windows, before leaving with a half-hearted promise to keep an eye out. As the door closed behind him, I felt a crushing sense of despair. I was alone in this. The police didn't believe me, and I had no idea who was tormenting me. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety and sleeplessness. I kept the lights on, my phone by my side, constantly checking the security camera footage. Every noise made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like a hunted animal, always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. Just before dawn, I dozed off on the couch, my exhaustion finally overpowering my fear. I was jerked awake by the sound of my phone ringing. I glanced at the screen and saw unknown caller again. A wave of dread washed over me as I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? This time, there was no breathing. Instead, a low, raspy voice whispered, I'm closer than you think. I dropped the phone, my heart racing. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I looked around the apartment, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, the sense of being watched more intense than ever. And then I saw it. Another note, this time slipped under the front door. My hands trembled as I picked it up, unfolding it slowly. The words were scrawled in a messy, frantic hand, you can't hide from me. I stumbled back, the note falling from my hands. I felt a scream building in my throat, but no sound came out. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room spinning. I was trapped, hunted, and there was no escape. Days melted into a blur of fear and paranoia. Each morning, I woke with a heavy sense of dread, my heart already pounding before my eyes opened. The notes, the calls, the shadowy figure, they all swirled in my mind like a dark, inescapable fog. The sanctuary of my apartment felt more like a cage, trapping me with my terror. Despite my growing unease, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I went to work, did my grocery shopping, even managed to meet Megan for coffee a few times. But every time I left the apartment, I felt eyes on me, watching my every move. It was a constant, gnawing sensation that burrowed into my mind and refused to leave. Megan was my lifeline through it all. She checked in on me constantly, offering words of comfort and practical advice. But even her presence couldn't fully dispel the fear that had taken root in my heart. I felt like I was living in a horror movie, with no idea who the antagonist was or what they wanted from me. One night, I returned home to find the front door ajar. My stomach dropped, and I froze in place, staring at the gap. I knew I had locked it before I left. The thought of entering the apartment made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just stand there. Slowly, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert. The living room looked undisturbed, but as I ventured further, I noticed things out of place. My keys were on the kitchen counter again, and my laptop had been moved from the coffee table to the couch. Panic surged through me as I checked each room, half expecting to find someone hiding in the shadows. When I reached the bedroom, my breath caught in my throat. My bed was neatly made. situation hitting me like a freight train. This person was real, and they were dangerously close. We called the police again, showing them the footage. This time, they seemed more concerned, promising to increase patrols in the area. But the reassurance felt hollow. The stalker had already proven they could evade detection, slipping in and out like a ghost. That night, I couldn't stay in the apartment. Megan took me back to her place, and I collapsed onto her couch, utterly drained. The fear and anxiety had worn me down to the bone, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a noise. I sat up, my heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound came again, a soft tapping, coming from Megan's bedroom window. My stomach twisted in knots as I crept down the hallway, my hands shaking. I reached the bedroom door and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. I approached the window, my breath catching in my throat. As I peered out, I saw a figure standing just outside, their face obscured by shadows. They were tapping on the glass, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent chills down my spine. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a scream as the figure pressed their face against the window, their eyes locking onto mine. A sinister smile spread across their lips, and they mouthed the words, "You can't escape." I stumbled back, my mind reeling with terror. I turned to run, but as I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The stalker was breaking in. Panic surged through me, and I bolted down the hallway, calling for Megan. She rushed out of the bathroom, her face pale with fear. "What's happening?" she cried. "He's here," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "He's inside." We ran to the living room, grabbing our phones to call the police. The minutes stretched into an eternity as we waited, every sound amplified in the silence. I clung to Megan, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. How had he found me here? What did he want? Finally, the sirens blared outside, and the police stormed in. They searched the apartment, but the stalker was gone, leaving behind only shattered glass and a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. As the officers took our statements, I felt a sinking realization settle over me. This nightmare was far from over. The stalker was still out there, watching, waiting. And he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The fear was suffocating, a dark cloud that overshadowed every moment. As I sat in Megan's living room, clutching her hand. After the police left, Megan and I sat in her living room, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us like a physical force. The shattered glass from her bedroom window had been cleaned up, but the sense of violation remained. I couldn't shake the image of the stalker's face at the window, the sinister smile that seemed to promise more terror to come. Megan made us some tea, her hands trembling as she poured the steaming liquid into the cups. "Sarah, we need to figure out what to do next," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "This can't go on." I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm cup, seeking comfort in its heat. "I don't know what to do, Megan. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Every time I think I'm safe, he finds a way to get to me." Megan squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with concern. "We'll get through this. We just need to be smart and stay strong." Despite her reassurances, the fear continued to gnaw at me. The stalker's presence had seeped into every corner of my life, turning even the simplest tasks into a nightmare. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't enjoy my favorite activities. All I could think about was the next note, the next call, the next intrusion. Over the next few days, I tried to regain some semblance of normalcy. I went back to my apartment, despite the fear that clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't let him win, couldn't let him take away my home. But every time I walked through the door, I felt a cold chill, as if the walls themselves were whispering of his presence. I installed more security measures, adding extra locks and reinforcing the windows. I even set up a motion-activated alarm system that would alert me if anyone approached the apartment. It felt like I was building a fortress, but it still wasn't enough to quell the fear. One night, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the security app linked to my cameras. I froze, my heart racing, and quickly opened the app. The footage showed a shadowy figure lingering near the entrance of the building. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure move closer, their movements slow and deliberate. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what I was seeing. They promised to send someone over, but I knew it would be too late. The figure had already disappeared into the shadows by the time the police arrived. They did a sweep of the building but found nothing. It was like the stalker was a ghost, slipping in and out of my life at will. The officers tried to reassure me, but their words felt hollow. I knew they were doing their best, but it wasn't enough. The stalker was always one step ahead, always managing to stay just out of reach. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse, but I was the one trapped, the one being hunted. I tried to stay strong, but the constant fear was wearing me down. I barely slept, my nights filled with restless tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares of the stalker breaking in, of his hands reaching for me. Every sound, every shadow sent a jolt of panic through me. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, always on edge, always waiting for the next move. Megan was my rock through it all. She stayed with me as much as she could, offering comfort and support. But even she couldn't dispel the fear that had taken root in my heart. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Sarah, I've been thinking. Maybe we should go away for a while. Just until things settle down. We could stay at my parents' cabin in the mountains. It's secluded, and no one would know where we are." The idea was tempting. The thought of escaping, of leaving the fear behind, if only for a little while, was like a lifeline. "Do you think that would help?" I asked, my voice tinged with hope. Megan nodded. "I do. It would give us some time to think, to figure out what to do next without constantly looking over our shoulders." I agreed, and we made plans to leave the next day. The idea of a secluded cabin in the mountains offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to breathe and regain some sense of control. We packed our bags, and early the next morning, we set off. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through forested roads and past picturesque scenery. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the tension in my shoulders began to ease, the beauty of the landscape a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. Megan's parents' cabin was a charming, rustic place, nestled among tall pines and overlooking a serene lake. It felt like a world away from the nightmare I had been living. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking our bags and exploring the cabin. It was cozy and welcoming, with a stone fireplace and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The cabin's isolation, which would have terrified me before, now felt like a protective barrier, keeping the stalker at bay. Megan and I spent the evening sitting by the fireplace, talking and laughing, trying to recapture some semblance of normalcy. The crackling fire and the warmth of her presence were comforting, and for a while, I almost forgot about the fear that had consumed me. But as night fell, the familiar dread began to creep back in. The silence of the mountains, which had been so calming during the day, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of the trees, every distant animal call seemed amplified, each sound sending a jolt of anxiety through me. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that we were far away from the stalker, that we were safe here. Megan noticed my unease and suggested we watch a movie to take my mind off things. We settled on the couch, wrapped in blankets, and put on a light-hearted comedy. But halfway through, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the stalker, wondering if he had noticed I was gone, if he was already planning his next move. Around midnight, Megan fell asleep on the couch, her steady breathing a soothing rhythm. I decided to go to bed, hoping that the comfort of the cabin would help me get some much-needed rest. I climbed into the soft, warm bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. But sleep was elusive. My mind raced with thoughts of the stalker, of his face at the window, of the notes and the calls. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, insistent tapping at the window. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, my breath catching. I lay there, straining to hear, hoping it was just my imagination. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I forced myself to get up, my legs trembling as I approached the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint shadow moving behind them. With shaking hands, I pulled the curtain aside, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the other side of the glass, was a note. It was taped to the window, the familiar messy handwriting glaring back at me in the moonlight. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my mind reeling. How had he found me here? How was this possible? I ripped the note from the glass and unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words. "You can't run from me," it read. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. He had found me. Even here, in this secluded cabin, he had found me. I rushed to wake Megan, my voice shaking as I told her about the note. She bolted upright, her face pale with fear. "We need to call the police," she said, grabbing her phone. But as she dialed, I felt a sinking realization settle over me. The police couldn't protect me. No one could. As Megan spoke to the dispatcher, I heard a noise outside the cabin. It was a low, rumbling sound, like an engine idling. My blood ran cold as I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, was a car. Its headlights were off, but I could see the faint outline of a figure inside. My heart raced as I turned to Megan, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's here," I said, my voice trembling. "He's outside." Megan's eyes widened in fear, and she rushed to lock the doors and windows. The police were on their way, but it would take time for them to reach us in this remote location. We were on our own. We huddled together in the living room, every sound magnified in the silence. The rumbling engine continued, a constant reminder of the stalker's presence. My mind raced with fear and confusion. How had he found us? What did he want? Suddenly, the engine cut off, plunging the night into an eerie silence. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, straining to hear any movement. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with agonizing tension. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. Slow, deliberate, each step sending a jolt of terror through me. Megan and I clung to each other, our eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door. A shadow fell across the window, and I felt a scream building in my throat. The doorknob rattled, and I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force it open. The locks held, but for how long? The police were still minutes away, and the stalker was right outside. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. The doorknob rattled again, more forcefully this time. The sound was deafening in the silence, each rattle a reminder of how close the stalker was. I felt a surge of panic, my body trembling with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with tension. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing. I turned to Megan, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. The stalker had found another way in. The sound of shattering glass pierced the stillness, slicing through my last shred of calm. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned to Megan, her face a mirror of my terror. We were out of time. The stalker was inside the cabin, and the fragile bubble of safety we had clung to was shattered. "Grab your phone," I whispered urgently. "We need to find a place to hide until the police get here." Megan nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up her phone. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled against the wooden floor. The cabin was small, and there weren't many places to hide. We slipped into a small closet in the hallway, the door barely wide enough to accommodate both of us. The darkness inside was suffocating, but it felt like our only hope. We crouched there, holding our breath, listening for any sound. The cabin was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made my skin prickle with fear. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in the confined space. Megan's hand gripped mine, her fingers cold and clammy. I strained to hear any movement, my senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through me. Then, I heard it, the soft, deliberate creak of footsteps on the wooden floor. The sound grew closer, each step a chilling reminder of the danger we were in. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to gauge the stalker's position. The footsteps paused, and I heard the faint rustle of fabric, as if he were moving slowly, methodically. He was searching for us, and it was only a matter of time before he found our hiding spot. I squeezed Megan's hand, trying to convey a sense of calm that I didn't feel. We couldn't stay here forever, and I knew we needed a plan. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The cabin had a back door, but it was on the other side of the living room. We would have to move fast, and silently, to avoid being caught. Just as I was about to suggest our next move, the closet door handle rattled. My heart stopped, and I felt Megan stiffen beside me. The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time, and I knew we were seconds away from being discovered. In a burst of desperation, I pushed the door open, knocking the stalker off balance. Megan and I bolted from the closet, sprinting towards the back door. I could hear the stalker behind us, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he gave chase. We reached the back door, and I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking with fear. The door swung open, and we burst outside into the cold night air. The forest loomed around us, dark and foreboding, but it was our only chance. We ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, the branches and underbrush tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear the stalker behind us, his footsteps a relentless pursuit. My lungs burned with the effort, but I pushed myself to keep going. The fear was a living thing, driving me forward, refusing to let me stop. We stumbled into a small clearing, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were trapped. The trees formed a dense barrier around us, and there was no clear path to escape. I turned to Megan, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We have to hide," I whispered urgently. "Maybe we can lose him in the trees." We ducked into the underbrush, trying to make ourselves as small and invisible as possible. The cold air bit at my skin, and I shivered, both from the temperature and the fear. I could hear the stalker's footsteps growing closer, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find us. The footsteps paused, and I dared to peek out from our hiding spot. The stalker stood in the clearing, his figure a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. He turned slowly, scanning the area, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't see us. But then, his gaze locked onto our hiding spot, and I knew we were out of time. He moved towards us with a predatory grace, his steps slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to defend ourselves, but I felt utterly powerless. Just as he reached the edge of the underbrush, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The sound was like a lifeline, cutting through the fear and giving me a glimmer of hope. The stalker hesitated, his head snapping towards the direction of the sound. For a moment, I thought he might flee, but then he took another step towards us. I grabbed a nearby branch, holding it in front of me like a makeshift weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling but defiant. "The police are coming. You won't get away with this." The stalker paused, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating menace. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "I'll be back." With that, he turned and disappeared into the forest, his footsteps fading into the distance. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Megan wrapped her arms around me, and we clung to each other, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us. The police arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found us in the clearing, and I could see the concern in their eyes as they took in our disheveled appearance. We gave our statements, recounting the events of the night, and they promised to do everything they could to catch the stalker. As we were escorted back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the stalker's final words from my mind. "This isn't over." The threat hung heavy in the air, a dark promise of more terror to come. I knew that as long as he was out there, the fear would never truly go away. Back at the cabin, the police secured the area, making sure we were safe for the night. Megan and I sat by the fireplace, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. We were both exhausted, but sleep was impossible. The events of the night replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of fear and desperation. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light over the cabin, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. The stalker had taken so much from me, my sense of safety, my peace of mind, my very sanity. But he hadn't taken my will to fight. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't keep waiting for the police to catch him. I had to confront him, to find out who he was and why he was doing this to me. Megan looked at me, her eyes filled with determination. "We're going to get through this, Sarah. We're not going to let him win." I nodded, feeling a spark of resolve igniting within me. "We need a plan," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that still lingered. "We need to trap him, to catch him in the act." Megan agreed, and we spent the next few hours devising a plan. We would lure the stalker into a trap, using me as bait. It was risky, but it felt like our only option. We couldn't keep running, couldn't keep living in fear. We had to take control. That night, we set the trap. I returned to my apartment, the fear a constant companion, but this time it was tempered by determination. Megan stayed hidden, ready to call the police at the first sign of trouble. We had set up additional cameras, ensuring we would have evidence of the stalker's actions. I sat in my living room, every sound amplified in the silence. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with tension. I could feel the weight of the plan pressing down on me, the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Then, I heard it, the soft creak of the front door. My heart raced as I glanced at the monitor, seeing the familiar shadowy figure slipping into the apartment. The stalker moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room. He hadn't noticed the cameras, hadn't realized he was walking into a trap. I stood up, my hands trembling but my resolve firm. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear that coursed through me. "What do you want from me?" The stalker turned, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, there was silence, the air thick with tension. Then, he took a step forward, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, but he was too fast. His grip was like iron, and I felt a wave of panic surge through me. I struggled, trying to break free, but his hold was too strong. Just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the door burst open, and the police stormed in. The stalker released me, turning to face the officers, but it was too late. They tackled him to the ground, handcuffing him as he snarled and struggled. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with relief and fear. Megan rushed to my side, her face etched with concern. "It's over," she said, her voice soothing. "He's caught. You're safe now." But as I looked at the stalker, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred, I knew it wasn't truly over. The fear would linger, a shadow that would take time to dispel. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The nightmare was ending, and I was finally taking back control of my life. As the police led the stalker away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. He hadn't won. I had faced my fear, and I had survived. But the journey wasn't over. There would be healing, rebuilding, and reclaiming the sense of safety that had been stolen from me. But I knew I wasn't alone. With Megan by my side, I could face anything. We sat in the living room, the dawn light filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. It was a new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The stalker was behind bars, and I was free to rebuild my life, one step at a time. But just as I allowed myself to relax, my phone buzzed with a new message. My blood ran cold as I read the words, "This isn't over, Sarah. I'll be back." The message sent a shiver down my spine, a cruel reminder that the nightmare was far from over. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. "This isn't over, Sarah. I'll be back." The words seemed to pulse with a sinister life of their own, mocking my fragile sense of security. Megan read the message over my shoulder, her face draining of color. "How is that possible? He's in custody. He can't reach you." "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But it feels like he's everywhere, like he has eyes and ears all around me." "How does he know?" Megan called the police immediately, and within minutes, officers were back at my apartment, examining the message and reassuring us that the stalker was securely locked up. They promised to investigate, to trace the message, but their reassurances felt hollow. The fear that had been a constant companion these past weeks refused to let go, tightening its grip on my mind. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleeplessness. Every shadow, every unexpected sound set my heart racing. I felt like I was being watched, even though the stalker was behind bars. The fear was a living thing, wrapping itself around me, suffocating and relentless. Megan did her best to keep my spirits up, but even her presence couldn't completely dispel the sense of impending doom. I tried to focus on work, on the mundane tasks of daily life, but my mind kept drifting back to the message, to the promise that he would return. One evening, I received a call from Detective Harris, the officer in charge of my case. His voice was calm but serious. "Sarah, we've been looking into the message you received. It was sent from a burner phone, and we're having trouble tracing it. But we have a new lead." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "We believe the stalker might have had an accomplice, someone who is still out there, watching you. We need you to be extra cautious. Don't go anywhere alone, and keep your phone with you at all times." The news was like a punch to the gut. An accomplice? The idea that there was someone else out there, someone working with the stalker, made my skin crawl. "Do you have any idea who it might be?" "We're following up on some leads," Detective Harris said, his tone reassuring. "But in the meantime, we need you to be vigilant. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, Call us immediately." I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. An accomplice. The thought gnawed at me, making the shadows seem darker and the silence more oppressive. Who could it be? Was it someone I knew, someone close to me? The uncertainty was maddening. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirl of fear and suspicion. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart pound. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by the invisible presence of an unseen enemy. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit back and wait for the police to find the accomplice. I needed to do something, to take back control of my life. I started going through everything I knew about the stalker, trying to piece together any clues that might lead me to the accomplice. I called Megan and asked her to come over. Together, we pored over the notes, the messages, and the footage from the security cameras. It was a painstaking process, but we were determined to find something, anything, that could help. As we reviewed the footage, something caught my eye. In one of the videos, taken a few days before the stalker was caught, I noticed a figure lingering near the entrance of my building. It was a brief glimpse, barely noticeable, but it was there. The figure was wearing a hood, obscuring their face, but the build was different from the stalker. This was someone else. I paused the video, pointing at the screen. "Megan, look. Do you see that? It's not him. It's someone else." Megan leaned in, her brow furrowed. "You're right. We need to show this to the police." We called Detective Harris and sent him the footage. He promised to review it and follow up on the lead. It was a small breakthrough, but it gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe we were finally getting closer to uncovering the truth. The next few days were tense, but the fear was tempered by a sense of purpose. I threw myself into the investigation, determined to find the accomplice and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. Megan was a constant support, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of my emotions. Then, one evening, as I was reviewing the footage yet again, my phone buzzed with a new message. My heart raced as I picked it up, dreading what I might see. The message was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "Look outside." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I glanced at Megan. "I just got another message." Her eyes widened in alarm. "What does it say?" "Look outside," I repeated, my voice trembling. We moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the darkened street. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the empty road and the faint glow of streetlights. But then, I noticed a car parked across the street, its engine running. A figure sat behind the wheel, their face obscured by shadows. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down to see another message. "I'm closer than you think." Panic surged through me, and I backed away from the window, my mind racing. He's here. The accomplice. He's right outside. Megan grabbed her phone, dialing the police as she spoke in a hurried whisper. "We need to stay calm. The police will be here soon." But the minutes stretched on, each one an eternity as we waited. The car remained parked across the street, a silent threat. I felt trapped, like a caged animal, with no way out. Just as the sirens began to wail in the distance, the car's headlights flared to life, and it sped off into the night. Relief and frustration washed over me in equal measure. We had been so close, and yet the accomplice had slipped through our fingers. The police arrived moments later, and we gave our statements, describing the car and the figure inside. They promised to search the area, to track down the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. The next day, Detective Harris called with an update. We found the car abandoned a few miles from your apartment. We're running the plates, but so far, it's a dead end. We're doing everything we can, Sarah. I promise you that." I thanked him, but the words felt hollow. The fear was a constant companion, a shadow that refused to leave. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I didn't know how to break free. Megan suggested we take a break, get out of the city for a few days. The idea was tempting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that running away wasn't the answer. I needed to face this head-on, to confront the accomplice and put an end to the terror. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on me, I made a decision. I would set a trap, just as we had done with the stalker. But this time, I would be prepared. I would lure the accomplice out into the open and force them to reveal themselves. I called Megan and explained my plan. She was hesitant, but she understood my need for closure, for a sense of control. We spent the next few days preparing, setting up additional cameras and alerting the police to our plan. The night of the trap, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every sound, every shadow felt amplified, my senses on high alert. I sat in my living room, my phone in hand, waiting for the next move. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to lose hope, my phone buzzed with a new message. "Are you ready to face the truth?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "Yes," I typed back, my fingers trembling. "Who are you?" The response was immediate. "You'll find out soon enough. Come to the place where it all began." My mind raced, trying to decipher the message. The place where it all began. My old apartment, where the first note had appeared. It had to be. I called Megan, explaining the message and our next move. We alerted the police, and they agreed to have officers nearby, ready to intervene if needed. As we drove to my old apartment, the fear and anticipation were almost overwhelming. I felt like I was on the brink of a revelation, the truth just within reach. We arrived at the building, the familiar sight sending a shiver down my spine. Megan and I moved cautiously, our senses heightened. The building was dark and quiet, the air heavy with tension. We made our way to my old apartment, the door standing ajar. My heart pounded as we stepped inside, the memories of the first intrusion flooding back. The living room was empty, the silence oppressive. Then, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. A figure stood in the doorway, their face hidden in the shadows. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear that coursed through me. The figure stepped forward, and the light revealed their face. My blood ran cold as I recognized them. It was someone I knew, someone I had trusted. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. The accomplice had been right under my nose the entire time. Before I could react, they spoke, their voice cold and detached. "You should have listened, Sarah. Now, you'll understand why." The air in my old apartment felt thick with tension, each second stretching into an eternity. The figure standing before me was the last person I would have expected, Jacob, a co-worker from my office. We had worked together for years, shared casual conversations, even coffee breaks. The shock of seeing him here, of all places, hit me like a physical blow. "Jacob?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes, usually so friendly and warm, were now cold and calculating. "You never noticed me, Sarah." "Not really. I was always there, in the background, watching you. You were always so kind, so perfect. And yet, you never saw me." I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "So you decided to terrorize me?" To invade my life and make me live in fear? He took a step forward, and Megan moved closer to my side, her eyes locked on Jacob. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, his voice low. But you didn't leave me any choice. I wanted you to see me, to understand. Understand what? I demanded, my voice rising with emotion. That you're a psychopath? That you enjoy tormenting people? Jacob's expression hardened. You think you're so smart, Sarah. So above everyone else. But you're not. You're just like the rest of them, blind to what's right in front of you. I could feel Megan's hand trembling in mine, her fear mirroring my own. But there was no time to be afraid. The police were on their way, but we had to hold on until they arrived. Jacob, this isn't the way to get someone to notice you. This is sick. You need help. He laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Help? No, Sarah. I'm beyond help. And so are you. Without warning, he lunged at us, his movements quick and aggressive. Megan and I stumbled back, our hearts pounding in our chests. I grabbed a lamp from the side table and swung it at him, the impact making him stagger. But he recovered quickly, his eyes filled with rage. Megan tried to shield me, her determination giving her strength. Leave her alone, Jacob. This is madness. He ignored her, his focus entirely on me. You don't get to walk away from this, Sarah. You don't get to forget about me. Just as he lunged again, the door burst open, and the police stormed in. The room was suddenly filled with shouting and the sound of heavy footsteps. Jacob froze, his eyes widening in shock as the officers tackled him to the ground, handcuffing him swiftly. I collapsed to my knees, the adrenaline leaving my body in a rush. Megan was beside me in an instant, her arms wrapping around me as we both trembled with relief and shock. The nightmare was finally over. Jacob was caught, and he couldn't hurt us anymore. Detective Harris approached us, his expression a mix of concern and relief. Are you both okay? He asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. We're okay. Thank you. The officers led Jacob out, his eyes still fixed on me, filled with a twisted mix of anger and longing. As the door closed behind him, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the fear that had gripped me for so long finally starting to dissipate. Megan helped me to my feet, her face pale but determined. Let's get out of here, she said softly. You don't need to be here anymore. We left the apartment, the place that had once been my home now feeling like a distant memory. As we stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, casting a soft glow over the street. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to reclaim my life from the shadows that had haunted me. Back at Megan's apartment, we sat in the living room, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. I felt exhausted, emotionally and physically, but there was also a sense of relief, of freedom. The ordeal was over, and I could finally start to heal. Megan squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with empathy. How are you feeling? She asked gently. I took a deep breath, trying to find the words. I feel lighter. Like a huge weight has been lifted. But I'm also scared. I don't know how to move on from this. She nodded, her expression understanding. It's going to take time, Sarah. But you're not alone. We'll get through this together. Her words were a comfort, a reminder that I had people who cared about me, who would support me through the healing process. The fear that had been a constant companion was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was something I could face, one day at a time.